Okay, Chapter 8, Lesson 8, Completing the Square. This lesson is continuing with a different method of solving quadratic equations. Up to this point, we've learned how to solve them by graphing, factoring, using square roots, and now we're going to complete the square. What exactly does complete the square mean? Before I answer what does that mean, let's talk about a perfect square trinomial. When a trinomial is a perfect square, there is a relationship between the coefficient of the x term and the constant term. Okay, there has to be, for it to be a perfect square trinomial, there has to be a relationship between the coefficient of the x term, which in this case would be 6, and the constant term. Here's your constant term. Okay. And what is that relationship? That relationship is you're going to take the coefficient of the x term, which is 6, you're going to divide it by 2, and then you're going to square it. 6 divided by 2 is 3. If we square that, we get 9, which is our constant. Okay, that's a perfect square trinomial. Let's look at x squared minus 8x plus 16. Here's my coefficient before the x term. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to divide it by 2, and then I'm going to square it. Negative 8 divided by 2 is 4 squared. So we get 16, which again is our constant. If I have an expression in the form x squared plus bx, that is not a perfect square. Because the reason that's not a perfect square is because we don't have this constant here. We don't have our plus c. Okay? However, you can use the relationship above to add a term to x squared plus bx to form a trinomial that is a perfect square. This is called completing the square. Okay? Let's practice that. Let's complete the square by finding our constant. Okay? I know that I have to take b divided by 2 and square it. This is in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, except I don't have a c, I have to find it. Okay, so I've got to take the value of b, which is your number before the x, so I'm going to have 10 divided by 2, and I'm going to square it. That gives us 5 squared, which is 25. Okay, you just completed the square. Look at b. Again, I want to complete the square by making a perfect square trinomial. So I need to find this constant. So I'm going to take the number before my x term, divide by 2, and square it. Negative 9 times negative 9 gives me 81. 2 times 2 gives me 4. So I have 81 fourths. Okay, you know how to complete the square. Now we're going to solve a quadratic equation by completing the square. And there are 6 steps that we have to follow. First, we have to write the equation in the form x squared plus bx equals c. Then we have to find the b divided by 2 and square it. Once we complete the square, we have to add b divided by 2 squared to both sides of the equations. Then we're going to factor the perfect square trinomial. We're going to take the square root of both sides. And then we're going to write 2 equations using both positive and negative square roots and solve each equation. I know this seems like a bunch of mumbo jumbo, but it's really not that difficult when we start using it, as long as we make sure we're following each step. So let's solve x squared plus 4x equals 15. By solving that, I mean we're trying to find the value of x. Okay. Let's solve this by completing the square. So step 1, is this in the form x squared plus bx equals c? Yes, it's already there. So step 2 is we need to find b divided by 2 and square it. Okay, this should be a 14 before we get started. Okay, so I'm going to have a 14 divided by 2 squared. 14 divided by 2 is 7. 7 squared is 49. So step 3 says complete the square by adding the 49 to both sides of the equation. So I'm going to have x squared plus 14x plus 49 equals 15 plus 49. Okay. Step 4, factor the perfect square trinomial. Here's our perfect square trinomial, so let's factor it. What are our factors of x squared? I have x times x. What are our factors of 49? It's perfect square. I have 7 times 7. When I add them together, I want it to be positive, so both signs have to be positive. So this is going to factor to be x plus 7 times x plus 7 equals 64. Okay, do I have to write this x plus 7 twice? No, I could say it's the same thing as x plus 7 squared equals 64. Now this is that we're at step 5 where you take the square root of each side. We're taking the square root because I want to get rid of the squared. So if I square root each side, I get x plus 7 equals plus or minus the square root of 64 is 8. So now I'm going to write my two equations to solve this for x. First equation is going to be x plus 7 equals positive 8, or x plus 7 equals negative 8. And I'm going to subtract 7 from each side, so x equals 1, or subtract 7 from each side, x is going to equal negative 15, and there's my two solutions. Okay. Look at B. When you're solving by completing the square, the first thing you want to look for is in the form x squared plus bx equals c. It's not. I know that I need to add 2 to each side. So I'm going to get x squared minus 2x equals 2. We are now in the form. So my next step is to find b divided by 2 and square it. So I'm going to have negative 2 divided by 2 squared, which gives me negative 1 squared, which is positive 1. I now have to add this 1 to each side of the equation. So I'm going to have x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 2 plus 1. Okay, factor your perfect square trinomial. Your factors of x squared are x and x. Your factors of 1 are 1 and 1. However, when I add them together, I want it to be negative 2, so this has to be a negative and a negative. Which that's going to factor to be x minus 1 times x minus 1 equals 3. Or in other words, x minus 1 squared equals 3. Square root each side to get rid of the squared. So I have x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 3. Now write your two different equations to solve this. First equation is going to be x minus 1 equals positive square root of 3, or x minus 1 equals negative square root of 3. Solve for x, I'm going to add 1 to each side. So x is going to equal the square root of 3 plus 1. Or if I add 1 to each side here, x is going to equal negative square root of 3 plus 1. Okay, put this in your calculator. Make sure when you put in your calculator, you close the parentheses on that square root and then add 1. Okay? in example 3, and I'm going to stop here. Because the rest of the examples are pretty much the same. But when we're solving by completing the square, the first thing we check for is it in the form x squared plus bx equals c? Well, in front of the x squared I need a 1, but here I have a -2. So how do I get rid of this -2? Well, if I'm multiplying by -2, I know I can divide by -2 to cancel it out. So therefore I'm going to have to divide by -2 all the way across. So that's going to leave me with x squared minus 6x plus 10 equals 0. I'm still not in the form equals c, so I'm going to have to subtract 10 from each side. So now I have x squared minus 6x equals -10. Next step is to find the b divided by 2 and square it. So I'm going to have -6 divided by 2 squared, which gives me -3 squared, which gives me 9. Now I have to add this 9 to each side of the equation. So I'm going to have x squared minus 6x plus 9 equals -10 plus 9. Factor this, I get x times x, 3 times 3, and they have to be negative. So I have x minus 3 squared equals -1. Because -10 plus 9 is -1. Square root each side. Uh-oh, what do you notice? I cannot take the square root of a negative number. Therefore, there is no real solutions. Okay, and that's that for that lesson.